Welcome back everybody, I'm Nick930, and today I want to share with you my thoughts on the most recent entry to the long-running Call of Duty series, Modern Warfare 3. Modern Warfare 3 is the third entry to the more recent Modern Warfare trilogy, this time created by Sledgehammer Games, with additional support from partners like Infinity Ward, Treyarch, Raven Software, and various other studios owned by its publisher, Activision. In it, players fight alongside an elite Special Forces unit, Task Force 141, as they respond to several terrorist threats throughout fictional nations in and around Western Asia. The game is a direct continuation of both the campaign beats introduced in Modern Warfare 1 and 2, and the seasonal cinematics featured throughout Call of Duty's recent live service multiplayer model, and therefore features familiar gameplay elements throughout each of its 15 campaign missions. However, because of the extremely tight time constraints the development team at Sledgehammer likely faced with this latest release, the many issues I had with Modern Warfare 2's campaign have only been exacerbated further, resulting in a disjointed and poorly executed experience that pales in comparison to the exceptionally well-made campaigns from the past, making this Modern Warfare 3 arguably the single worst mainline campaign in the series' 20-year-long history. So let's start this review by first taking a spoiler-free look at the game's story. Modern Warfare 3 kicks off with a familiar set piece, with a Special Forces team breaking into the infamous Russian Gulag to rescue a high-value prisoner. Though, in keeping with the precedent set by the past two games, this prison break is far less bombastic than its 2009 reference point. The action sequences are a little bit more grounded, with the squad tactically taking out sentries, cutting the power and using night vision goggles while rappelling in through the main prison complex. There are plenty of firefights throughout, but don't go in expecting slow-motion breaches or nods to Michael Bay's The Rock here. For the most part, this entire mission stays true to the classic Call of Duty formula, with decent pacing, fun set pieces, and even some well-executed narrative bits. But this is sadly one of the few instances throughout the record-short campaign to feature this level of quality. Immediately after this level, the game switches to a far less interesting open combat mission that limits narrative beats to the intro and outro cinematics, along with a few cheesy radio back-and-forth moments that annoyingly repeat themselves if you take too long. The purpose of these open combat missions is very clearly not to expand on the scope of the story itself, but rather pad out the length of the campaign with boring open-world style objectives, sidestepping the need to script epic moments or animate AI companions to fight alongside the player. The fan-favorite characters do return here, like Price, Gaz, Ghost, and Farah, though the big addition here is undoubtedly the return of antagonist Vladimir Makarov, who's been put at the forefront of this campaign, making for a much more interesting villain dynamic than what we saw in last year's Call of Duty. For the most part, Makarov is executed quite well. He seems to be just about as cunning and ruthless as he was in the original Modern Warfare trilogy. Though, to keep players on their toes, many of his schemes play out a bit differently, with new targets and execution aimed to subvert expectation. That being said, these changes don't necessarily lend themselves to making this character appear any more ruthless. In fact, the scope of his targets feels noticeably less ambitious, as the game relies heavily on using its new fictional nations like Urzikstan and Kastovia to drive its story, making his devastating attacks feel much less impactful than what we've seen him do in the past. Another issue I have with this campaign, and many of the campaigns coming out of the Call of Duty series lately, is its over-reliance on these larger-than-life supporting characters. These characters don't even feel like real people anymore, with no confrontation between them, no personal flaws, or any sign of actual growth throughout the story. They're basically just a team of C-tier Avengers, bouncing overly cool one-liners back and forth at each other, until one of them finally breaks the loop and tells the others to get into position. The Call of Duty series has never really been one for interesting, dynamic characters, but it wasn't as noticeable before, because the campaigns were being carried significantly by its action set pieces and variety. Now that the missions are more grounded and simple, we get more time with each person, and the cracks in this aspect of the game's writing are more apparent than ever. And by the end, I really didn't care what happened to any one particular character, considering they're all pretty much identical personality-wise. But these issues are minor when compared to Modern Warfare 3's biggest flaw, its mission structure. In the hopes of strengthening the campaign and making it feel more complete, it appears developer Sledgehammer and their supporting developers opted to make use of the resources already at hand to craft new open-ended levels referred to as open combat missions. These missions almost always use pre-existing environmental assets from Modern Warfare 1 and 2, mainly the Battle Royale map Verdansk, and are populated with a bunch of basic AI enemy patrols for players to contend with. The idea is to give players the chance to approach the missions their own way, searching for alternative routes to objectives and discovering useful weapons and gadget stashes hidden all throughout. Players are given a special pair of binocs to tag enemies, and can then set out in any direction that they feel like, so long as they stay within the invisible boundaries. Parachutes and ascender cables can be used to reach advantageous positions. Night vision goggles can be found to navigate in dark caves, and silenced rifles can be used to stealthily pick away at the enemy to clear heavily guarded positions. Had these been optional missions like the cooperative Spec Op missions from last year, these would have been a nice addition to the campaign. But they're mandatory, and sometimes they're laid out back to back in the campaign, making them feel even more tedious. It's more or less the same thing that the Battlefield series has tried doing for years within their own campaigns, repurposing its large multiplayer maps, changing the time of day, and then throwing in some rudimentary stealth action mechanics and weapon stashes. And just like those campaigns, the resulting experience feels uninspired and massively outdated. The reason Call of Duty's campaigns have been so successful over most of its lifetime is that they made heavy use of scripting to drive a narrative experience. Players would feel like they were participating in massive battles across iconic backdrops. AI soldiers would run alongside you as you stormed beaches and defended monuments. And each mission would try and mix things up, introducing unique mechanics like the AC-130, or long-range sniping in missions like All Gillied Up to help keep the action feeling fresh. By scrapping all of the scripting and obvious action movie references, what you're left with are the remnants of an FPS stealth game with about a tenth of the depth and complexity that make games of that genre interesting. What's more, you're not even rewarded for playing the game stealthy either. There's no achievements or rewards for remaining undetected, so you might as well just grab as much armor as you can and blast enemies away, as the cutscenes are the same regardless of how you choose to play. Another big reason why these open combat missions don't really work is that Call of Duty's suite of gameplay mechanics really don't lend themselves well to unscripted, open-ended stealth. The controls are pretty much identical to those used in last year's Modern Warfare 2, with things like the ability to mantle and hang from ledges, in addition to all the mechanics introduced in 2019's Modern Warfare, like active sprinting, mounting, and field upgrade items. Though, new to Modern Warfare 3 is the tac stance, that allows players to turn their gun at an angle and fire without having to aim down the currently equipped scope. This I feel is a very nice addition, as it allows players the freedom to use more cumbersome scopes like thermal or magnified sights, while still maintaining the close quarters efficiency of a smaller sight. The weapon spray and bullet spread is wider, meaning it's not going to be nearly as effective as aiming down, say, a red dot sight. But it's also not quite as loose as hip firing either. What's more, the tac stance can also be used while sliding, which should definitely come in handy in fast-paced multiplayer matches. As for its use in the campaign, I found the feature to be quite useful in some circumstances, as the game really likes to slap those thermal and NVG scopes onto the default guns quite often. Though, activating it with the default control scheme is a bit clumsy, as you need to first ADS and then tap down on the D-pad to toggle the stance, which can also be difficult to keep track of when under fire in close quarter situations. Other than that though, Modern Warfare 3's gameplay systems haven't really been changed all that much from Modern Warfare 2, which is why it's so bizarre that 90% of the campaign is built around sneaking and stealthily dispatching enemies. Outside of crouching or going prone, there's not really any stealth mechanics in these games. There's a takedown maneuver when you get close, but even this is limited, as there's no option to take an enemy hostage, hide their body, or even initiate this takedown from any unique positions like from the water or above from a high ledge. Occasionally, you can find bottles to throw as a distraction, but these don't even seem to work right. and you're better off just shooting groups of enemies as fast as possible instead. Which brings us to the other glaring issue here, the enemy AI. The detection AI in this game feels remarkably basic, with an inconsistent cone of vision, limited hearing capabilities, and pretty much no coordination between one another. If an enemy in a group suspects something, they won't talk to their nearby allies or coordinate a search. They'll just break away from the group and search themselves. When an enemy is suspicious, the UI prompt will glow yellow, warning the player to break the line of sight. If the player fails to do so, then the enemy UI will turn red, and the enemy will reach for their gun, giving the player less than a second to neutralize them before they shoot and alert the entire base. Annoyingly, even this is inconsistent, as there's times, especially in this more narrative-driven mission, where the enemies would just automatically go on alert, despite not a single loud firearm having been discharged. In the open combat missions, getting caught isn't necessarily the end of the world. The enemies will run around shooting for a little bit, but they can easily lose track of you if you run and stay hidden for long enough, and will eventually return to a slightly more cautious patrol pattern. Mission objectives are never impacted by these alerts either, so it's not really worth restarting or loading from a checkpoint, unless you really just want to try and complete the mission as stealthily as possible. Sometimes, the missions will even force you into combat, making efforts to remain stealthy pointless as well. There were other times where I remained stealthy the entire time, but the game's dialogue triggers seemed to think differently, causing Price to change his tone to a panicked shout, while Laszlo constantly reprimanded me over the comms. Thankfully, there are a few more traditional missions mixed in that help keep the experience just barely afloat. One mission that takes place in a snowy Siberian forest feels like a proper Call of Duty mission, complete with a flashy opening setup, some coordinated stealth maneuvering, and a large battle at a frozen port. Though even this feels basic when compared to similar types of missions we've experienced in the past. And despite having to play through the campaign twice this weekend due to a recording issue, I still can't recall any genuinely interesting gameplay moments or identify any one mission that I'd actually want to replay for fun. Finally, let's talk about the game's actual visual presentation. From the onset, Modern Warfare 3 maintains its impressive visual prowess we saw on full display with 2019's Modern Warfare, with fantastic character renderings in the cutscenes, some nice specular lighting in gameplay, great use of atmospheric effects, and some nice animation designs. Nothing here is necessarily new from last year's Modern Warfare 2, at least nothing that stood out a great deal. But it certainly has its moments, and from a performance perspective, the game ran beautifully from start to finish, even with Nvidia's DLSS disabled at a native 4K. I didn't even find there to be too many bugs or glitches this time around, which is definitely an achievement all on its own, especially considering how insanely buggy last year's release was at launch. The game did crash once or twice, usually when trying to load the next mission, but this likely had more to do with the recording software I was using than the game itself. The only real issues stemmed from the game's shoddy AI design, that, as I mentioned previously, make the stealth sequences incredibly inconsistent and annoying. I would have also liked to see more frequent checkpoint saves throughout the longer open combat missions, along with more progress being properly saved, as I found sentries I have taken down before respawned after I loaded from checkpoint, effectively resetting my progress and forcing me to find alternative routes out from completed objectives. Another issue with the presentation is that the open combat missions also suffer from much worse overall visual quality than the more scripted missions. The lighting feels less complex, the LOD is reduced significantly, and things like texture quality and environmental geometry feel like a noticeable step back. Weirdly, even this traditional level in Siberia looked out of place, as the characters' textures looked terrible when compared to their models in previous levels. And things like snow deformation are weirdly absent despite being in past games in the series. It's just a mixed bag overall, and not at all up to the standards players would expect from the newer console generation, indicating that perhaps it's time for another engine refresh for next year's Call of Duty. Overall, Modern Warfare 3's campaign is easily one of the most disappointing campaigns I've played in the series. Having enjoyed Call of Duty's single-player offerings since 2003, This felt like a major decline in quality for one of the series' most important sub-series. It has become painfully clear that the success of Call of Duty's Battle Royale mode, Warzone, has forced the studios to abandon prioritization of its single-player offerings, despite many major games throughout this year proving that there's indeed still a big market for quality solo experiences. The characters feel like walking advertisements for skins. The missions are built on recycled multiplayer content from 3 years ago. The main menu UI is still atrociously bad, and aside from churning the gun sideways, there's really nothing of note here that even comes close to justifying this latest game's inflated price. Unless you enjoyed last year's Spec Op missions and are excited to play 15 remastered multiplayer maps from 2009, I'd highly advise against purchasing this game at release. Call of Duty has delivered far better material in the past, and until there's more original content offered in Modern Warfare 3's multiplayer, there's just not enough here to justify picking this up day one. But what do you guys think? Did you have more fun with Modern Warfare 3's campaign? And if so, what did you like about it? Let me know in the comments section. And be sure to stay tuned for a detailed direct comparison coming soon between Modern Warfare 3's multiplayer and last year's Modern Warfare 2. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.